Chopra, Religion of Sports. You've directed several documentaries with athletes. Tom Brady, Tom versus Time. LeBron James, Shut Up and Dribble. Now you have Conor McGregor, McGregor Forever. Give me a quick background on yourself. How did you get into making sports documentaries and documenting the greatest athletes of our generation?
And so, I am an obsessive sports fan. By background, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. So Celtics, Bruins, Red Sox, Patriots. I'm also first generation American. So my parents are all from India. And, growing up, like sports was the language by which I assimilated and became American. So I've always loved it. I'm a filmmaker by background. I used to be a reporter and journalist. And I'd probably say maybe 10 years ago, like the rise of ESPN's 30 for 30 gave me the opportunity to bring those two things together. Huge sports fan, storyteller. Oh, this can actually live together. So that's sort of like the origin story. Around that time, maybe 10 years ago, I actually ended up meeting Kobe Bryant. And Kobe, who I probably around the same age, but spent a lot of time rooting against as a Celtics fan. He and I sort of became fast friends and collaborators. He was a storyteller by nature, even as he was, a Hall of Fame basketball player. And so he and I ended up working on this project called Muse for Showtime many years ago. And I would say that was like the first real big entry point into the world of sports storytelling and a certain profile. And then Kobe, obviously by reputation, not the easiest guy to work with. I started, but also just, iconic. And so that project got noticed, but it really gave me a lot of capital to go out and be like, well, and people would say to me all the time, it's like, man, if you could work with Kobe and you could get along with Kobe and Kobe trusted you, then yeah, maybe I should talk to you. And I'd say after that, Tom Brady became the next one, Tom versus Time, that I've developed a relationship with. And that's what it is. It's a series of relationships. I mean, they obviously success, leads to the next one and the next one, and the next one. But it's also like getting to know, these athletes, these people, that's where the success is. And so Conor is the latest, maybe the greatest. Definitely the most challenging, I would say. But gotten to know him over the last 3 years because that's how long it's taken to get this project out.
So what drew you into Conor McGregor? Obviously, he's this big, large personality, but what drew you into doing this with Conor?
I mean, the fight game. Actually, it's not like a sport that I knew a lot about or that I grew up watching or that I was hugely passionate about. But, I've certainly been to a bunch of fights and, there is something primordial about it, right? Like at the end of the day, like, and you can have the greatest trainers and nutritionists, which Conor, by the way, does. And even they say it, like, all we do is we get this guy ready. Then he walks into the octagon and he's on his own, and it's survival. I mean, that's really what it is. That's its most basic form. Two guys or two women enter a ring and one of them walks out. That's sort of, that is, goes back to the beginning of time. And I think that really interested me, fighting, mixed martial arts as a sport. But then back up, like, here's this guy who, is arguably the best to do it, certainly like the most iconic and controversial, and he's just a showman. So like, yeah, there's what happens inside the octagon, but man, this guy is dynamic outside the octagon. And then just as I started to spend time with him and get to know him, like, the thing about Conor is, like, despite all that chaos and noise and everything, when you're with him, he's present. I think it's like his great gift as a fighter also. It's like you can't walk into that octagon with all the, chaos. Like, you have to be focused. And he's kind of the same way. Like, it's hard to wrangle him, but when you sit down with him, he's talking to you and he's listening to you and he's very honest and he's very articulate. And so he's a great subject.
Conor is this larger than life personality. What was that first meeting like with him? What were your first impressions when you got to meet with Conor for the first time?
Well, like the first, I think I ended up like going out to Dubai. He was training for technically the second Poirier fight, but really the first one that I was involved in. And so I was out in Dubai with him, and I'd say the first few interactions were really just observational, like going to some of his training sessions and really uh, just just watching him do his craft. And it was, I mean, look, he's again, despite all of the carnival atmosphere that you're often around when you're with him, especially in the promotion and preparation of a fight, like when he's training, he's a mad scientist. He's a perfectionist. He's actually very similar to Tom Brady, Steph Curry, LeBron James, all these people I've worked with. He's obsessive. There's never a moment where Connor's I just never been around him where he's like, oh, you know what, guys, I think I've had enough for the day. Like, let's cut this training session short. Quite the opposite. Like you're told like 2 hour training session, 4 hours later, you're like, man, this guy doesn't stop. He just won't give up. Like he wants to tweak every little thing. So that was it. We were also like right up into the lead up of the fight. So we had to like pick our moments when actually to sit down with him. But I think we were like at some resort in Dubai, and he was just like sitting having dinner, and he said, "Call me over." He called me over to sit down, and it just was like talked about the kids, talked about like what it was like to be in Dubai. We were all dealing with the crazy pandemic and testing and everything. And I was like, oh wait, he's kind of normal. So, amidst all of this. So, like I said, he's a hard guy to wrangle because there's so much going on always. But when you're with him, he's just sort of like a normal person, which I thought
So,
was
so what is
pretty
the most
fascinating.
what is the most surprising thing that you learned about Conor? Is it that he's just a normal guy, that he's a family guy, or is there anything else that you learned from him that you didn't expect to learn from him?
Like, yeah, I mean, that probably a little, but it's worth noting. He is a family guy. I spent another time out here in Los Angeles where he called me over. He was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he's like, "Oh, I'm taking the kids out to go to the park." And so, like, I went over and like we drove to the park with the kids, and he's just like a dad trying to like, balance that thing, like let your kids play on the jungle gym and just watch over them, but kind of let them fall so that they learn how to, pick themselves up and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a sense of normalcy, which is because I've also been with him in Vegas, leading up to the fight, doing the press conferences. I mean, it's like wild. Like he's a wild man. Everyone's seen it. But so I guess that contrast is really fascinating. But I'd say the thing that was sort of interesting to me was this is a guy who everyone else in the world gets really like distracted by the losing. Like he lost to Khabib, and we were in that training room afterwards. The camera's there anyway, and like everyone is like sort of like, including Dana was in the dressing room. And if you'll remember after the Khabib fight, right, like there's all this chaos, like guys jumping in the ring and Conor like he couldn't care less. He was like, that's that. I lost. That's all that matters. But and he was disappointed, of course, but he's also just like immediately trying to figure out like, okay, like how can I use this? How can I literally and figuratively pick myself off the mat? He's just not distracted by other things. And I just thought there was like a sort of really interesting clarity for, we fill up the airwaves and stuff talking about the guy over and over and over again. But he just kind of is like, he dials in. He's a fighter. He loves to fight, and he's not particularly bothered by losing. He says it all the time. He's like, you don't do this if you're not willing to lose. Like losing is a part of the game. And I just thought that was sort of interesting, like that he knew how to like make sense of losing.
So you've been around some of the great athletes of our generation: Kobe Bryant, Tom Brady, now Conor. What similarities, what characteristics do they have in common, do you think, especially Conor with the other guys, with Kobe and Tom and
Yeah,
everybody else?
he's a mad scientist. He's obsessive. Personality wise, he probably couldn't be. He's quite similar to Kobe. Like there's a defiance and a combativeness, to him, of course. Um, but he couldn't be opposite of, Tom Brady or Steph Curry. I would say is like the most gentle guy, But again, what they have similar, I would say, is Steph. I've been to training sessions with Steph, like shoot arounds. This is the greatest shooter in the history of basketball. And he still obsesses over like tiny little things that he thinks are going to make him better, that are going to improve his, his craft. Conor the same way. It's like you will be at training sessions, and for hours upon hours, he has everything filmed. Then he'll watch the film, and he's looking for these tiny little things to help him get better. And some would argue that he's one of, if not the greatest fighter, UFC fighter that's ever lived, and yet he's not satisfied with that. It's like, no, I can be better. I can do more. I just need another half hour in the sparring, to see if I can do this thing. And it's like, there's just something, it's obsessive. It's this, despite all the fame and the fortune and all the hullabaloo always around him, he just is like, that's not what it's about. For him, it's about like, can I be better? And that is, pretty similar to, and always like, I could have done better. He always like looks back, like, I could have done this different. And so therefore I'm going to try it again.
I think I saw the documentary. I watched it over the weekend. I think as somebody who's covered, I was at his last fight when he broke his leg. I think my main takeaway is we see these moments of vulnerability. Usually he's a showman, he's an alpha male, he's always super confident. But I think what I took away was the vulnerability. He's not always super confident when he's training. When he's lost, when he's losing, you can kind of see that how bad he feels. We that's a side that we don't see. Is that something that you didn't see before that you saw now?
Yeah, you get a peek behind the curtain, right? And it's really interesting. My personal take is like, you see these superhuman like athletes who do amazing things on the court or in the octagon or whatever. But when you see the actual human being, and that's really impressive, but when you see the human being that, like you said, is dealing with loss, is dealing with failure, is figuring out how to pick themselves up and do it all over again, it makes it that much more impressive, right? Like that, oh, these are real people that have to not only navigate disappointment, in their craft, but are also, by the way, like he's father of three, he's trying to manage a relationship. He's built this huge business. A bunch of people like depend on him. And so it's just like navigating all of that and yet being back out in the octagon and, trying to be the best version of to win. Like these guys are competitors. These, women that I've worked with, Simone Biles, they're competitors. And so they desperately want to win. And every time they don't, it's hugely disappointing.
All right, a couple more questions from me. Any behind the scenes anecdotes? I know he's a wild guy. Conor's wild. Anything that you can share behind the scenes that you kind of startled you a little bit?
I mean, I think it was like the first Poirier fight that I was part of, the one that was in Vegas, when he was on, so no, sorry, the second one. The first one like was interesting because there was actually like, that was out in Fight Island, and he was, he and Dustin had this very respectful like dialogue and relationship. The second one was completely different. And so I was in Las Vegas with him, and I was at the press conference, which was like a classic Conor McGregor just circus. And at one point, like it got so crazy that he had to be like rushed off the stage. And it's like I felt like it was like the president of the United States. We were like being, the bodyguards like dragged us off the stage and pushed us into like a holding cell. They're like, you have to stay here until it's safe. I was like, what do you mean it's safe? And they're like, oh, it's just like too crazy. And so I was like in this room. It was like me, Conor, I think maybe one of his bodyguards, one other person, and it was like not a big room. And he was like a caged lion, and he was just like going. I was like, holy shit! Like this is not an act. This is like, this is real. Like he's really just, he amps himself up, which again, I think you kind of have to. But like, I was just like, I've been around a lot of great athletes, and I've been around, some intense moments before Super Bowls or whatever. I've never been in anything like this. This is, and I was just like, you know what? We're not going to make eye contact. I do not want to make eye contact with this guy. So it was interesting. And then, like I said, on the flip side, I went to the park with him, not far from here in Beverly Hills. It was just like a bunch of people on a Sunday, like with their little kids, and Conor, he's just like a dad, and I was like, how are these the same people? It doesn't make sense, but that's him.
All right, so McGregor Forever being released Netflix May 17th. What main takeaway our viewers are going to have when they see this documentary?
I mean, he's a fighter. I think one of his trainers says, "Reasonable people never accomplished anything. Conor is a very unreasonable man." I love that quote. I think it says a lot about him. Look, he's the most resilient person I've ever been around, and I think that's inspiring in its own way. And not just like I'm not an athlete like that. You don't have to be an athlete to appreciate how to deal with disappointment. And Conor's one of those people who's like, he's a walking masterclass. Like, how do you pick yourself up off the mat, literally? And I found that inspiring. And I think that's like, I dropped in on him the last 3 years. There's been a lot of struggle, like at least inside the octagon. It's been tough, like with the 2 losses against Poirier, coming off the Khabib, etc. And yet, like, the guy's as formidable and motivated as he's ever been, and that is interesting and impressive.